Hello and welcome to this lecture for the Chrysalis Diploma in Counselling Skills and Theory. This is for Component 6, Development, Motivation and Creativity. And this is Module 9, which focuses on motivation and goal achievement. You can find the standards to be met by this particular component outlined in Moodle and in your written course materials. Today I will share some slides with you throughout this lecture, and you will also be able to download these from Moodle if you wish. Do please note any questions that you might have as you're watching this lecture, and take these to class to discuss with your class tutor. Of motivation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about neuroscience first. And all of this information is in your notes, so please read those as well. So Davidson, Jackson and Kalin identified various areas of our brain that respond to our experiences of motivation. So for example, I'll just give you one example. Your notes go into this in a little bit more detail. So for example, our left hemisphere of our brain is activated even at the thought of achieving something which is personally significant to us. And there are other areas as well. However, there's also an area in our brain which acts as a sort of motivational inhibitor, and that's linked to that feeling of giving up when the going gets tough. Some people will give up more easily than others. And it's also worth noting, and as I say, the notes go into this in a little bit more detail, but it's worth mentioning brain plasticity as well, and that's the ability of our brains to create new neural pathways for ourselves through change in experience, and obviously therapy can help you with that. So we're going to go on to look at Freud's approach now. The unconscious libido energy is goal directed, and what we mean by this is that unconscious motivation is is linked to our hidden and repressed and unknown desires. So motivation, that's what Freud would say, that we're all goal directed, but the motivations that we have are linked to our unconscious desires, to our repressed desires, to those hidden parts of ourselves. And actually, to be able to understand what to do about those, we need to become consciously aware of those hidden and repressed desires. So, and this can be done by kind of trying to bring those unconscious desires to the fore. So a Freudian therapist, for example, would look at dreams, which are often the representation of our unconscious desires, and other forms of unconscious communication. I'm also going to mention here the approach of Rogers, the person-centered approach. And obviously this is linked to Maslow's work as well, and we're going to talk about Maslow's work a little bit later on. Both of those are part of the humanistic approach. But Rogers has the idea that it's natural in a person to be motivated, but actually we need to connect with our true self, with our inner self, to be able to move forward. And to do that, we need to be able to understand ourselves, to be honest with ourselves, and to kind of uncover that real true self-worth. And we can only do that by being congruent, by being the person that we're meant to be. So in this approach then, those words that you should, or you ought to, or you must, don't really apply. We think of if we think of society and think of sort of cultural norms, we often live by these ideas of we should do this or we shouldn't do this, and actually Rogers would say those ideas, really, those shoulds and oughts and musts have no place in an exploration of how we really feel, because those social norms which tell us that we should do a certain thing don't necessarily relate to what we truly want to do. So if we look now at CBT, which looks at the beliefs about self, others, and the world, and CBT approaches propose that low motivation and the inability to reach goals and the inability to reach those, to achieve those changes that we want, that kind of low motivation is due to our distorted beliefs about either ourselves or about the environment that we're in. But we're going to come back to CBT a little bit later. We're also going to come back to Maslow a little bit later, which is why I'm moving quickly on. So we're going to look at McClelland as well, and again we'll do that a little bit. There's a specific slide on that a little bit later, but just in a nutshell, this is a sort of organisational approach. And when we look at organisational approaches, it's not necessarily an approach we would use in therapy, but it's just worth having a look at. You might find these sorts of approaches in life coaching or even within organisations where they're trying different approaches to get the best out of staff, to increase motivation in staff and the workforce. But we're going to come back to that one later as well. There's a specific slide all about that. So let's start with Maslow and the hierarchy of needs, which you have come across probably a couple of times already in your studies. But what you will notice here is there's a little bit of a difference. So you've probably previously only seen 5 levels in this hierarchy. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But in general, Maslow saw that we do each have the capacity to reach self-actualization, which previously was at the top of his hierarchy. But he said that the problem was that this capacity to progress was often disrupted by various things. So, for example, a relationship breakdown or job issues, just various challenges that life throws at us every so often. So although he felt that people were moving generally towards self-actualization, actually what actually happens in practice is that people move forward a little bit and then back a little bit. So there's a constant sort of, moving back and forth. And in 1970, he refined his ideas a little bit, and he added some different sort of needs onto his hierarchy, which he felt was more reflective of the needs that we have and our abilities to progress through those needs. And he actually, you'll have noticed that there's a different label at the top of the hierarchy. So in 1970, when he added more refinement, he also added this new level of transcendence. And up to now, self-actualization is related to our own personal needs, our own true self, if you like. But transcendence is more linked to motivating forces in terms of values outside of our own personal sphere. So it might include, for example, personal service to others. It might include even mystical experiences or religious experiences. It might include scientific pursuits or religious pursuits. So it's something that's outside of our personal needs and our personal motivations. Okay, so we're going to go on to looking at a cycle of change, which is a CBT approach, really. So I'm going to go through the different stages first. So this is from work that was done by Prochaska and Di Clemente in 1986. So it would start with pre-contemplation, for example, with no intention of changing behaviour. And I'm going to go through these and then I'll go back and explain them a little bit more. So that leads to contemplation, so being aware a problem exists, but no real commitment to action. Then preparation, where somebody is intent upon taking an action. That leads to the actual action, so where they actually modify their behaviour in some way. Obviously, that needs to be maintained if it's to become a new behaviour. So sustained change, new behaviours replacing the old behaviour. But then sometimes we relapse, so we fall back into patterns of behaviour and we need to start the process again, which is why it's a cycle. So this is often used in therapy for addictive behaviours. It's often used in addiction work. But you can probably see that this would also be really useful for working with clients and volunteers on self-defeating behaviours and habit-type behaviours. So if we look at each one in a little bit more detail, so if we start with pre-contemplation, where there's no intention of changing the behaviour, this might be the stage that somebody's at if they've been sort of sent to therapy by somebody else. So for example, it might be that somebody particularly wants their partner to stop smoking. They don't like smoking. They hate their partner smoking. So they might try and make an arrangement with a therapist, a counsellor or a hypnotherapist, for their partners to stop smoking. And their partner might kind of feel press-ganged into going along to that first session, but it's quite obvious from the first session that actually they're not really interested in doing this. They've got no intention of changing. And they're just there really to placate somebody else. And we often say as therapists that, you know, sometimes therapists do get that phone call or that email from a person that's not going to be the actual client. It's a good thing to do in this situation to just say, you know, okay, I appreciate you making this arrangement, but actually I need to speak to, you know, I need to speak to your partner or your brother or your sister or whoever. I need to speak to that person because I need to know if they're ready to change. Because if somebody isn't ready to change, it's not really going to happen. So looking at the next stage, contemplation. So this might be the time that somebody does enter therapy because they're aware that a problem exists for them. At the moment, however, they might not have any real commitment to action. They might not really be aware that they really have to do anything. They might think just by coming to therapy, that's enough. And that's part of that initial consultation where we talk about our commitment to a client or a volunteer, but we also discuss what we're expecting from them, because if things are going to work, we give our commitment, but we also expect a commitment back from them. It's a teamwork effort, it's collaborative. So I think the others are quite self-explanatory, but just a word about relapse. I quite like this cycle because it's quite positive, and it shows that even when somebody relapses, it's not the end. They can start the cycle again. And actually, we often think of relapse and that falling back into old patterns as failure, but actually, as we know, failure, if you want to call it that, or relapse, gives somebody a real opportunity to learn from the experience. So there might have been certain triggers that precipitated that relapse. And that's really, really useful information. you know, when we're talking about therapy, we often look at what works, but we're looking at what doesn't work as well, because it's, you know, knowledge is power, I suppose, is in a nutshell, really. So relapse can be useful, and it can inform your therapy and your behaviour from there on in. Okay, so I said earlier we were going to go back to these organisational approaches. I also said you might not use these so much in therapy, but you do often see them in life coaching, which is not the same as therapy, but obviously there are some kind of links or relationships. But it's worth knowing what this model is about. So this approach proposes that individuals will come from different perspectives regarding the need to accomplish things. So they will have different motivational forces. And these different motivational forces can be categorized into the following. So some people will have as their motivational force the need for power, in the sense of being influential or being able to impact other people. So McClelland, in his model, distinguished between two types of power. And one can be regarded as a selfish sort of power, an ego-centered power. But the other is power that's used for social benefit, and where you influence people for the common good. The second type of motivational force or different perspective will be the need to affiliate. So people that take pleasure in being with other people and are motivated by the sheer pleasure of doing things together with the people that they like and love. So, you know, we're talking about, you know, people who like people. When you're working towards a common goal, people who are motivated by affiliation find energy in how good everyone else feels. And lastly, the need for achievement, so reaching towards a meaningful goal. So people who continually strive to improve and can be relentless learners. You know, we all know people who absolutely have that love of learning. And then there's other people who are a lot more practical. There's other people who you might regard as, you know, a people person. So there's all these different sorts of people, and actually this can be really useful in terms of personal development, and in terms of working out where you fit into society, or working out what the best career would be for you, the best path in life would be for you. It's about understanding your own needs, basically. Okay, so when we think about the pluralistic approach, the approach that we have in our therapy in Chrysalis, where we can use different models and approaches to best fit our client. We always start with a goal. We talk about, you know, what do you want to achieve? And, you know, these clear goals, it's our starting point. And we often ask the question, okay, so that's your goal. So how will you know when you achieve that goal? It's an important question. And to that end, Duran in 1981 came up with the idea of SMART goals. And we use these in therapy, but you will have probably heard of SMART goals generally in life, often use them in workplaces, for example. So SMART stands for specific, measurable, attainable, realistic or relevant, and time-bound. What's really important about these goals as well in therapy, well, generally, I guess, that they need to be achievable. Because if you set people goals, or in therapy, you should be doing that collaboratively, If you collaboratively set a goal based on what the client is presenting with, and it's a huge goal, actually what you can be doing is setting someone up to fail. We all know how we feel when we fail. Failure is not good for our sense of self-worth. Achieving things going forward when we have a low self-worth is very difficult. And often in therapy, we are trying to we're trying to help encourage someone's self-worth to or self-esteem to improve. Often people come to therapy with that very low sense of self-esteem. So we know that self-value, that self-worth is the foundation of being able to go on and achieve things. So it's really important that, say, a client comes to us with a huge goal for themselves, that we do have those challenging conversations sometime, and we talk about how realistic are those goals, how can we split that goal down into some sub goals, for example, where we can instill that sense of achievement as we go along, because we know that if a client can achieve a small sub goal and have that huge kind of self-esteem boost, they're more likely to feel enthusiastic and encouraged to go on to achieve the next goal. So when we're talking about goal setting, it's part of that case formulation that we do right at the start of therapy. So I'm going to have a look at how we would do that, how we would create a plan to assist our clients and our volunteers. So we start with looking at goals and looking at how realistic those goals are, and setting those goals and going through that SMART. Is it specific? Is it measurable? Is it achievable? Is it realistic? Is it relevant? And is it time bound? Have we got some sort of structure in there for that goal? And then we'll also be looking at underlying obstacles and client strengths, mechanisms which are preventing the goal, and why is the client seeking help now as well? Because often clients will come to you in therapy, and actually they might have had these issues for a long time, but something's obviously changed. So what's changed now? And then you can create a collaborative plan with your client or your volunteer, which you're both happy with. When you're looking at obstacles to therapy, that's important, obviously, but you're also looking at the resources that the client can call on. We talk about negatives all the time in therapy. Often our clients are bringing very negative issues, very negative thoughts, very negative behaviours. But we need to redress that balance a little bit as well, and remind clients of the strengths that they have. So looking at situations where they have really called on that inner strength, and they've also called on those external resources. Remind them of the support they have from their friends, who they can call on, the social networks they have, what sort of support they can call on from family and friends. It's really important for them to realise that whilst things are difficult, and while there may be some obstacles, and while there may be some challenges, actually they also have some positive resources as well. Okay, so we're going to look at the process of therapy in the pluralistic approach. So, making meaning by talking through the goal in order to understand it better. We do this in therapy. We obviously, you know, we enable that, we encourage that talking, that exploration by offering those core conditions of empathy, of being non-judgmental, of active listening, making sense of the issues around reaching the goal. And that's something that we do collaboratively by exploring issues. Problem solving, planning and decision making. Changing behaviours. That's something that we help and support and encourage clients and volunteers to do. But sometimes we do have to stop and challenge gently our volunteers and clients, because we can't actually change their behaviour for them. We can create that support system, but we can't do it for them. Negotiating how to cope with the change that the goal may bring. Remember here those secondary gains, those hidden agendas. Any change, even positive change, can bring stresses with it. Stress is linked to change. And when you think about that stress inventory that you look at in therapy, there are positive events on that stress inventory. We're hoping these changes are positive, but there will be some relapses on the way. There might be some secondary changes that go with it that are quite difficult to handle. There might be those secondary gains or those hidden agendas come into play. So there's going to be a lot of negotiation, and there might be a little bit of forward and back movement here. Dealing with challenging emotions and feelings, which is also linked to this. Analysing and acting on information. Undoing self-criticism and enhancing self-support. I talked a little while back about the foundation of all this is our sense of self-worth and our self-esteem. And dealing with difficult relationships, because clients, volunteers don't do this on their own. You know, no man is an island. We all have relationships. We are social beings. So anything that we do affects the other people around us as well, and the relationships that we've got. So we're going to look at any obstacles to our motivational energy. So physical issues, environmental issues, financial, historical experiences, relationship issues, practical issues, and emotional issues. So if we look at these in turn, when we're talking about physical issues, for example, we're talking about illness, injury. We could also be talking about stress as well. So there's obviously a link between some of the emotional issues as well and physical issues, because we know there's a huge mind-body connection. Environmental issues, if we talk about, for an example, a work situation that somebody wants to change, the journey to work might have a huge impact on motivation, or even the physical environment at work might not be quite right. And some of these things a client might not be able to change, but some of them they might well be able to change, and maybe they need a bit of help thinking outside the box with some of these things that they've just accepted, and actually there are ways to alleviate them. There may be financial constraints. Lack of money may well be an issue. There might be something that a client really wants to do and really feels motivated to do, but they just simply haven't got the money at the moment. And again, there may be some things that they can do to try and alleviate that. But some things you might have to accept that at the moment, that's not something you can change. But that will be personal for every client. Historical experience. You know, I think that sort of speaks for itself. And in therapy, we often have to look back at the past, even if we're taking a CBT approach, for example. all of those negative thought patterns, they have a history. There's, they haven't just arisen out of nowhere. Relationship issues as well. So, for example, if a client's or a volunteer's partner is really unsupportive, or their family's unsupportive, that might impede their progress. They might have to have some really honest, open conversations and try and get people on side. Practical issues. It might be the responsibilities that you have. It might be family responsibilities, for example, or parental responsibilities, which are holding you back in a certain way towards eliciting a certain change. Or it might be your home environment, or it could even be things like your time management skills. Emotional issues, and these are obviously often the deepest issues, and that's where our unconditional positive regard comes in, our non-judgmental approach, our active listening, our empathy. But of course, there may be very, very specific times as well when our motivation will be especially affected. So those times, for example, could include periods of illness. They could include periods of bereavement or depression. And I mentioned depression here because actually one of the symptoms of depression is that lack of motivation to do anything, that feeling that there's no point doing anything, and what might be at the root of that is that very, very low self-worth and self-esteem. Depression is a year 3. It's a year 3 issue. It's not something that in year 2 you would generally deal with. We do deal with people with a low mood, but sometimes it's difficult to see where a kind of low mood, in mild low mood, ends and depression starts. So if you have any concerns about any of your volunteers who've presented with a very mild low mood, obviously talk to your tutor about that, because there may be a need to refer if what presented originally as a mild low mood, it is really presented as depression. So we're going to look at some of the things that you can do with clients and volunteers, some of the ways that you can work with your volunteers. So one of these exercises that you could do is called a doubts and benefits exercise. And there is an example here of somebody taking a driving test or wanting to learn to drive. So basically, what you're asking your client or volunteer to do is to come up with a list of doubts and a list of benefits, so kind of pros and cons, if you like. And each doubt and benefit is then given a weighting. So if we look at that particular example of wanting to learn to drive and we look at the doubts, so one of the biggest doubts, for example, might be a fear of failing, a fear of failure. And this might have all sorts of historical roots. It could be to do with past experiences of failure, all sorts of emotions, all sorts of self-value issues are going to be wrapped up with a fear of failure. And those negative thought patterns are going to be linked to those past experiences and how you see yourself as well. And so you're going to have to take lessons, obviously. And then, if you've got a fear of failure, you're going to be thinking about, what if I make a bit of a fool of myself? What if I fail my test? What if I fail my test repeatedly? People will laugh at me. They may well not laugh at you, but if you've got into that negative thought pattern, that's the way your thoughts will spiral. And the medium doubts might be more practical, for example, linked to the cost of lessons and affording a car that has credibility with friends. And that's not so much a practical one. That's more of a feeling that you've got to present a certain persona to the outside world. And the smaller doubts might be, okay, I've got to find a good instructor. I've got to upkeep the costs of the car. So you can see there, when you look at those doubts, we've got failure type doubts, quite a big issue there. But we've also got some financial issues there as well. So when we look at the benefits, so the big benefits to learning to drive for this person would be they would have more independence, they would have greater flexibility, they'd be able to leave later for work, maybe they'd even be able to have greater freedom in terms of work, because they'd be able to look for jobs outside of their current sort of radius that they can travel to. Medium benefits, they wouldn't have to rely on public transport anymore, so actually that would save them money, wouldn't it? They'd be able to keep up with their friends a bit better. And the small benefits might be work related as well, so leaving, that's repeated actually, leaving for work later. They might be able to impress people a little bit more. They're interested in cars anyway, so actually it would just be nice to have a car to kind of satisfy that interest. So this is something that, an exercise that you could actually do with your clients, and even this will take quite a lot of talking, quite a lot of exploration. But once you've done that, you can create a motivational ladder. So this can be done in conjunction with the doubts and benefits, and you're looking at those doubts and benefits, and you're kind of creating a sequence, because your success at passing your test, ultimately that's the goal, isn't it? So when we talked about SMART goals, your overall goal might be passing your test, but actually that's quite an overwhelming goal at the moment. That's going to take some time, and passing your test depends on a lot of other things all along the way. So that overall goal now has been split up into a sequence of sub-goals, and the sequence looks like this. So addressing the fears of failure, that's something that came from one of those big doubts, and it's what was shown, what was demonstrated by that previous exercise was that underlying all of this is that real fear of what happens if I fail, what happens if people laugh at me. And even when you looked at the medium doubts, you'd got the what happens if I can't afford a car that has some credibility. So this person obviously has a really deep-seated concern and fear of failure and fear of looking bad in terms of other people. So that's the foundation for all of this work, addressing those fears of failure. And then looking at the researching lessons available. Forming some sort of timescale, which you can do collaboratively within your therapy. You can do that together. So some sort of timescale which is realistic for your client or your volunteer. And now we come to one of the quite big obstacles as well, because this came up quite a lot as well, didn't it? So acquiring the necessary funds. And sometimes people present these obstacles and go, well, I just can't afford it anyway. And maybe that is a real issue for this person, but maybe that was one of those things, I just can't afford it anyway, which was kind of masking that fear of failure. So you might have to help your client or volunteer really think outside the box here. There are ways that you can save money. So, you know, but it's not for you as a therapist to go, well, you can save money doing this and you can save money doing this. Ask them, you know, how do you think you could do this? You know, are there some options? So that's quite a practical conversation that you're going to be having with them. Choosing a driving instructor. Again, they might feel really underconfident in their own choices, and that might be to do with their fear of failure. So although you're addressing the fear of failure right at the bottom, that's something that feels in this in this example, that fear of failure feels like something that is underlying all of this process, and it will start at the bottom, but it won't be a quick fix because it's probably something that has got a real historical root in past experiences. So that's something you're going to have to, it's going to work, you're going to work through that, through this entire process. So when your client or volunteer has done that, the next goal will be to actually book those lessons. Again, so you're splitting that down, finding a driving instructor and booking, you're splitting that down into achievable goals. So every step of the way, your client is achieving. When you book the lessons, the next step is to attend those lessons and ultimately to pass the test. Now, if we think of perhaps our own experiences of this whole process, if you're a driver yourself, you might not have passed the first time. That can give you a real knockback, especially if you've had a fear of failure that you're working on continually. But we might have to really support our client or our volunteer through that, because they might go back to that same behavioural pattern, those same thought patterns. They might, if they fail their test, really at this stage want to give up, and their fear of failure, which you think that they've got a really good handle on by now, might suddenly kick in. So it's that kind of almost like that relapse, isn't it, to those old thought patterns or old behaviours or old feelings. But with your support, they can work through those and almost in some ways have to, start this process again. So this is a really, really good thing that you can do with clients. You can start with the doubts and benefits, explore all of the different issues, look for patterns as we did. The fear of failing was something that underlay all of it, the financial issues, and then create this, this sequence, this motivational ladder, but absolutely making sure that you do it collaboratively and you don't push your client at the rate that you think they should go, because it's got to be at the pace that they want to take. So we've actually come to our last slide. So this slide is just looking at empathy, because when we work with clients, empathy is absolutely key. It underlies everything that we do. And when we're working with motivation, empathy is so important. It's absolutely vital when we're working with motivational issues. And I'm going to read out the following words from a client quoted by Carl Rogers. In counselling, we, the therapist and the client, were mostly me working together on my situation as I found it. It was the role of the counsellor to bring me to myself, to help me by being with me in everything I said, to realise what I was saying. I was never conscious that he was reflecting or restating things I'd said, but only that he was right along with me in my thinking. Because he would say to me things which I had stated, but he would clear them for me, bring me back to earth, helping me to see what I'd said and what it meant to me. And that's a really, really powerful quote, because when we're in therapy with a client or in year 2 with a volunteer, we are totally entering into their world. We're not in any way imposing our world or our experience onto the therapy. And I think that's really, really important, especially when you're doing exercises with clients and volunteers that feel like quite practical exercises. feel almost like life coachy type of exercises. And we have to be very clear that yes, we can use exercises that sometimes feel a little bit practical, but it's not about us using our practical skills that we might have to kind of set a pace for the client. It's not for us to decide what they have to do as their next steps. It's not for us to advise them of those next steps. We're actually sort of entering into their world and kind of walking beside them, but we're walking beside them on their path, not ours. And lots of students come into counselling from their own line of work, and often students come into counselling because they've been doing a kind of helping people type of role in their careers. I know not all of you, but some of you. But the type of helping roles outside of therapy are a little bit more paced, and they are a little bit more directive and prescriptive. So I wanted to end with this because this is just a reminder that that's not what therapy is about. It's just a reminder that, empathy is about walking with them, beside them, on their road, in their world, and it's not ours. And I think this is just such a powerful quote from a client that shows how that can work in practice. I hope you've enjoyed. I'm just going to stop the share. So I hope you've enjoyed the lesson today. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through motivational issues. These can be quite frustrating issues for both clients and therapists. So it's worth thinking about how you deal with frustration and how you deal with those issues yourself, how you deal with motivation yourself, but also how you might deal with clients and volunteers who are working very much at their own pace, very much step by step, because that is something that can elicit that frustration in us. So before you have your online class with your tutor, it's great that you've listened to this. Thank you very much. Go through your module notes, write down any questions that you might have so that you can really use that online lesson to its best purpose, and you can clarify any points that you need to. And thank you very much for listening today. Okay, bye-bye.